Hey there, my Ground Force customers and friends. Tim Goff's here with you today, the host of the Taking Care of Business podcast. Today, we're going to talk about safety and driver education programs. I have with me today John Mullins. John is partners at Synergy Solutions and the Driver Education Network. They are a fusion partner with myGroundForce, and they are experts on how to train drivers and all aspects of your safety program. So, John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, John, just Taking Care of Business podcast, what we're trying to do is help dive deeper into certain elements of mandatory programs that FedEx service providers have to know. And obviously, your companies and I work together pretty closely, and we have some mutual customers. But why don't you tell us about John, and then we'll talk about your companies.
So I started out in trucking in the late 80s, actually as a night dispatcher, and then worked my way into driving in the yard and then driving on the road. Went in the military for a little while, came back, really liked it. It was in food distribution, and kind of worked my way through that industry for about 30 years. And back in 2019, I decided I kind of got a wild hair and decided to do software for a short period of time. Found out that was really kind of a rough business.
Who are you telling?
So I went into consulting. I had people that I knew that wanted help, and every transportation organization I'd ever seen, struggled. And I'd always built organizations that were very safe. One of the last organizations I ran was a company called Shamrock Foods, and our CSA score is a decimal. I mean, we were just fantastic. And we had other divisions, and when you went to the other divisions, they were in trouble, and they just weren't doing the things they needed to do. So, John and I ended up partnering. John had worked for me before. He was a terrific leader. And we went out and started talking to people. And, at the time he was a risk manager for National Interstate. And he was very frustrated because he would go out and do audits of people and tell them, here's the things you need to do. But as being the insurance person, he couldn't do anything for them. So he couldn't train their drivers. He couldn't write policies. He couldn't do any hands-on. And then he'd come back the next year and give them the same report he gave them last year because they just didn't have the capacity to do it.
Yeah.
They didn't have a big office staff. That trucking doesn't have a huge margin. So he got real frustrated doing that. He said, "Hey, look, I want to be able to help these guys." And he had a conversation with one of the people that was a customer of the insurance company, and he wanted to get 4 companies together to hire John to be their safety manager. He said, "Well, if we put all our money together, we can afford you because your typical safety manager is 6 figures." And
the good ones anyway.
Yeah, the good ones. And so, I told him, I said, well, I'm consulting in transportation. Why don't we start, why don't we start doing it together? So we got together, we started doing it, and, it just blew up from there. The way we ended up having Driver Education Network was, almost everybody we went into didn't have training. They weren't training their drivers, and if they had cameras, they weren't managing their cameras. And we'd explain to them, hey, if you have cameras, you got to manage that. That's discoverable. It's the best tool you can have. In my opinion, it's the best safety tool of our lifetime. It's the best way to change your behavior. And, you got to train your drivers in the expectations. So him and I built some training, and I showed it to a teacher friend who promptly told me it was terrible. And if you've ever seen training by a safety person, it's typically a PowerPoint. It's a great place to take a nap, right? So we asked her, can you help us? And, she at the time was writing curriculum for the state of Texas, and she specializes in adult learning. So she went through and built this terrific training. And so we said, all right, well, let's start building training. So we started building training, and then we ended up taking on one of our customers' cameras, and initially John and I watched the cameras, and, we would watch the events every day and coach the drivers, and that all bloomed into a big business. So it was really kind of out of need, right? So that's kind of how I got where I am.
Wow, there's a lot of information there that we're going to unpack. A couple things that you mentioned that are near and dear to my heart. Oftentimes, people think about training as they give them a video to watch and they're all good. And this is what happens in the service provider space oftentimes. Or they consider they went to a course, or they listened to a podcast, or they did something, and now they know. It's a transfer of what I call is transfer of knowledge. In my history, in some of the big organizations that I ran, I created training programs that didn't focus on transfer of knowledge because you can't generate revenue with that. What you need to do is develop competencies like you and I did in the Navy. You had to prove that you could do the job. You couldn't just read a book and be signed off on it, you know? And so that's what you guys bring to this space that I'm really excited about. And one of the reasons that, you know, I decided to partner with you guys. But look, there's a lot of things that you guys do and that you just covered that I want to go back a little bit in the things that you talked about and kind of unpack. So one of the things you said is that pretty much every trucking company you went to didn't have an effective training program.
Correct.
So I would say in my experience, that's very similar to what I see oftentimes in the service provider space. And most of the time what I hear is we can't afford to do that. What are your thoughts on that? When you hear some potential customer that's talking to you, oh, well, we can't afford to do training like that. What's your response to that?
So my response usually is you can't afford not to.
Yeah.
If you hire somebody who's under 35, they have been texting in their vehicle since they were 15. You are going to have to train that out of them. And that starts with, here's my expectation. And let me give you some tools. So, you know, one of the things we do in our training is we'll tell them, you know, hey, here's the rule that DOT has, the one-touch rule for being distracted, right? But then here's some techniques you can use to not be distracted, because it doesn't do you any good to tell somebody the rule and not give them any tools to administer it, right? You're trying to change that behavior. You're going to have to give them good driving behaviors. You know, if you look at the driver force, you know, you have these drivers that are 55 to 70, right? And then everybody else is young and they're really inexperienced. You know, back when I drove, you know, you had to have sometimes 5 years experience to get into a company. If you wanted to drive for ABF, you had to have 10 years experience. You know, now, you know, if you know what a truck looks like and you got a CDL, they're going to stick you in it. So you really are going to have to spend time on those people, educating them and teaching them to drive safe. And training is super important for that. You know, some of the struggles I see with contractors and with everybody that deals with training is most of the products out there are very labor intensive for the operator, meaning that you have to go into their LMS, you have to build a learning plan by driver, you have to push that training out to the driver. And if the driver doesn't take it, you have to make sure you go look to see if they took it. And then you have to resend it to that driver. Oh, and on top of that, that driver has to have a username and password, which is always very difficult, right? They're truck drivers. So you just end up having to spend a lot of your labor managing getting your driver trained. And then that training, a lot of that training, the driver can press play and let that training play and never watch any of it and just take the quiz till they pass, right? Just keep taking it till they get an 80%. So, you know, it's not effective. They didn't learn. They learned how to pass the test. They didn't learn anything. So, you know, we really try to focus on our training short. We send it to the driver. We send it the first Monday of the month, and we send a reminder every Monday. So we kind of we create the capacity for the operator. So we're going to get the driver to take that training. We're going to tell them if the driver's not taking that training, but we're going to keep reminding them because, you know, that driver's running hard. He might have had a hard week and he couldn't take his training. We're going to remind them next week, hey, take your training. And then we try to give them training they can take on their time. Because if you think about it, and like the FedEx world's a great example, the driver gets there and they drop their trailer in the dock door and they're waiting for the next trailer and they're sitting in their truck on the clock. Great time to take my training, right? You want it to be convenient to that driver because drivers hate coming in before their shift and especially after their shift to take training, which is the way when I managed years ago, I always did it, you know, hey, I'm glad you worked, 14 hours today. Now come in the office and we're going to spend a half an hour going through training or come in on Saturday on your day off and I'm going to train you. So
well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's one of the things we do in myGroundForce. We're partnered with Safety Forward and that link is in our driver app, and the login and password is auto-negotiated for the driver. So he does get notifications that he needs to.
Sorry.
You okay?
I'm okay.
He does get notifications that the training is due, and then it's very easy for him to just click in the app and everything's resolved. But again, the training requirements in this service provider space is the driver has to have at least 1 year experience, and there are some modifiers on that depending on did he go through a different kind of training program or whatever. But essentially, we'll call it 1 year's experience, and then he can drive a truck in the FedEx space, right? And that is scary, to be honest with you, as you already mentioned. And so then you really need to have a program on how you assume control of what that driver got trained on. So I'll use me as an example. I had an onboarding program And I want to talk to you about your onboarding program, because what I discovered is this is not very common. So we had a 3-day orientation in my company. I paid guys from all my 9 locations to travel to our central office, and they went through 3 days of orientation. Some of it was, here's how our company works, here's the employee handbook, all that. This is how you get paid, here's how you take vacation, all those things. But then every one of my drivers went through the Smith System safe driving course, defensive driving course, I think they call it, and they got certified. I had train-the-trainers on my team. And so everybody went through that, including classroom and in the company vehicle. We had a little Honda CRV that they got to practice in, and then we put them in the big truck to practice in. And then they had a minimum number of trips that they had to run to make sure that they understood FedEx process and what the training on how to be a safe driver and all these things that you just talked about. This is how we did it. And then they had a check ride where the instructor was quiet the whole time. He just rode along like a ghost, and then you'd get a score at the end.
Observing behaviors.
Yes. And so we talked a lot about behaviors, right? And you've mentioned behaviors. What I often hear is service providers are so stressed in their systems that they really just don't want to see videos. They'd rather have cameras that don't generate a lot of videos, and the ones that they generate are easily handled. Sometimes they have their admin looking at those videos, or their senior driver might run through and look at it, and they're trying to execute this at the minimum possible workload. And so this is why I came to you guys, because that's not sufficient. So what I would like to hear from, why don't you tell us about what you guys are working on with us and the services that we're bringing to this service provider ecosystem, from the opportunity to go through onboarding and actually orientation and driver education. And you have your own defensive driving course that we can put drivers through. And then we have the camera and hours of service management programs. So why don't you talk us through those things and tell us how you guys deliver those services and the results that you can typically see.
Okay, so we got into orientation because we dealt with a lot of people who didn't have orientation, and kind of the myth is, I'm small, I'm not one of the big companies that has 10,000 trucks. I'm not FedEx, for example, so I can't have this big orientation program. We don't have to. But you have to have an orientation program. You have to bring them in and get to know them. We know, because we have teachers that work for us, that 64% of Americans read at a 6th grade level. So if you hand them a piece of paper and tell them read this and learn it, you're kidding yourself.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a famous thing with driver's manuals. So here's the rules. You should have known the rules. They never read the driver's manual.
Yeah.
You need to teach it to them, and you need to teach them how it applies to your business. So we really kind of got into that as we were doing, these risk audits with customers and helping customers hands-on with safety with Synergy. We started seeing, hey, what are you doing when you bring them in? Because that is really important. So many people spend so much time hiring that they don't realize if they just spent the time once they got them in to get them past that 90 days, they wouldn't have to hire so many drivers.
Yeah.
Because they're just wasting all that. They have all that effort to get them to apply, and they don't spend any effort once they get them. So, taking the time to go through it and having a consistent, repeatable program. So if I teach it, it's the same as if you teach it. And so when we built this product, we built an electronic product that it goes through everything. It starts out with culture. So we make a video about the customer. Hey, here's where they started. Here's some pictures of them when they started. Here's why they're in business. Here's why it's cool to work here. Because everybody misses that, and one of the things I always tell them is, you can take a U.S. Marine and stick them in Somalia, and they will be thrilled about their job. You should be able to make a guy excited to get into your truck and work for you and get a good paycheck, right? It shouldn't be that hard. But the Marines do a great job of it, right? He's going to go get shot at and maybe get killed, and he's going to be in the desert, and it's going to be a rough job.
Smiling all the way.
When you're giving this person a wonderful job and a nice truck, and you should be selling that, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these smaller companies have great culture. I would imagine when you ran it, the drivers knew you. You can go talk to the owner. You can go, everybody knows everybody, yes. Right? So you should be selling some of that. So we typically start that process with that. What's your culture? Sell some of your culture. And then when we build it, it's electronic. We put 10 of our trainings in there. It's stuff like hours of service, alert driving, which is distracted driving, following distance, speed management, scene of an accident. What do you do if you're involved in an accident? What are the keys in a pre-trip? We kind of focus on the, not the detailed everything you would do for a DOT pre-trip, but what are the things you need to look at that when you hit a port, you're going to get a ticket for, like your fire extinguisher not being hooked, right? Big ticket all the time, and just one of the real dumb ones in my opinion. So
absolutely,
we put all those trainings in there, and then we sit down with that customer and we'll build. Hey, what do you do in HR? Do they they're going to fill out a W-4, and they're going to do the I-9 and all that basic stuff. That should be 10% of what they do. That paperwork should be 10%. Everything else should be classroom, hands-on, face-to-face, doing something with that driver. So many people, their orientation is come in and fill out all this paperwork and the truck's outside and good luck, right?
Yeah.
You can't do that. You have to spend time with them. The programs we build typically take anywhere from 2 hours to 2 to 3 days, depending on the size of the customer and how much they want to teach. If you have a lot of things you have to teach, like if you're a FedEx contractor, there's, you have KIs, you have all these things that driver has to know that they have to perform or you're going to be in trouble, right? So you're going to have other stuff they have to do. Yeah. If you're running in an area that requires that driver to chain up, you're going to want to, in that orientation, we're going to tell them, stop, go outside, chain up a truck, because you don't want that driver learning to chain up at a chain up station. When we do pre-trip in there, one of the things we build with the customers, we'll say, hey, when you get ready to, he'll go through our pre-trip training, or the driver will, right? And then we have, okay, trainer, stop, go outside, log into the system, whatever you're using for a pre-trip, and do a pre-trip on a truck and talk about the things that are specific to that truck. And we have customers that do different jobs. And so one of the things we always tell them is give that driver a job. So like, for example, we deal with some tow companies. So if he's going to go tow a Tesla, what is he supposed to have for that Tesla? Give him that and make sure he can find that stuff on the truck. And if you can't, explain to him where he'd get it if it's not on the truck. And, if you think about it, if they're hauling any other type of freight, do they have to have a load lock? Do they have to have a seal? What's required for that job they're going to do? Make sure they can do that, right? So go do some hands-on. So it's some classroom, then it's, and we put our modules in there, right? And one of the things that you kind of touched on is they don't just want to watch video, right? When we do a train the trainer with the people who do orientation, and we tell them, you can't let that play, and we don't put the quiz in it. You can't take the quiz. You have to go through the questions with the driver, and you have to go through the quiz with the driver. And part of that is when you tell somebody about a pre-trip, it's different for every company. It's different for every truck. If you're getting Kenworth made a truck that had a pedal to open the hood. Stick a driver in that's never dealt with that, they won't be able to figure out how to open the hood.
Right.
So you want to do that hands-on. You want to teach this stuff when you're talking about a pre-trip. Hey, in our trucks, you want to watch for this, right? If you're hauling for somebody that requires certain permits to get in, or certain things have to be in that book in the truck, right? You want to cover that. So it's as you're going through that training, and we're talking about, hey, here's the things you should look at, for example, in a pre-trip. We want that trainer to be able to say, and in our company, here's something else that goes with that. And that goes also along with distracted driving. We teach, here's what you need to do to not be distracted. Here's the rules, and here's some tools to not be distracted. But then that trainer might say, hey, in our company, we have a mount on the dash, or in our company, we have an allowance for a Bluetooth headset, or whatever that is, right? Or here's how I learned not to use my phone. Now it's more personable. It's more me teaching you versus, back to your point of I watched a video and now I'm supposed to go do that, right? It's somebody, teaching me, right? And it's getting that person talking, because we always talk about the person doing the most talking is doing the most learning. And when you do orientation, that's what you want. You want that driver giving you feedback. Hey, have you ever dealt with a camera in your truck before, for example, when you talk about the cameras? What was your experience with that? Well, okay, let me tell you what our cameras pick up and what you can expect when you have a safety event in ours, if you have an unsafe behavior. I think a lot of people, when they don't have an orientation program and cameras specifically, and they don't touch on that camera, when cameras came out, the big companies, UPS is probably a good example, but and maybe not UPS, but some of the big companies really used it for bad. The Teamsters made it really bad. I'm going to fire you if you're on your cell phone. I don't know who fires drivers the first time they're on a phone, but they must have a lot of drivers standing in line.
Exactly
everybody I know
right.
doesn't, right? I need to build a good driver, because the next one I get might not be, might be bad too, right? So, you're going to have to work with that person. So you want to be able to explain, hey, that camera's there to help you. That camera's a tool. And, I'm 55 and I always tell drivers, because, I grew up at the Animal House, that camera's the angel on my shoulder going, don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't make that mistake, right? It's there to make them a better driver. It's there to remind them when they do something they shouldn't do. And, kind of back to that younger driver that texts, they're going to pick their phone up for muscle memory. They have done it so much for years. And all of a sudden, hey, I can't touch my phone. And it's just, and you'll see them on camera go, oh, crap. And they'll put the phone back down, right? So you're going to have to work on them. You're going to have to give them some training and some tools, and you're going to have to use that camera to coach them, and you're going to have to explain to them that it's not there to get them in trouble. It's there to get them home safe.
Yeah.
Because, as a carrier, you have a duty to keep them safe, sometimes from themselves.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's so much there in what you said. When I look back on my time as a line haul contractor, and it's interesting. The first 18 months, we had no accidents. I had the best safety score in the district. And in the next 9 months, we had 9. And I went from first to last. And the attention I got was unpleasant. Mm-hmm. And more than half of those accidents were distracted drivers. The other half were sleepy drivers. And all of these guys knew better, right? But I think one of the challenges that service providers face is they don't have the background you and I have. Okay, so what you just described is exactly the program you went through when you got trained in the military. You even referenced the Marines. It's also the same program I went through as a pilot. It's you get introduced to a concept that you've already studied. You get to demonstrate that concept. Then you have to practice that concept, and then you have to prove you have mastered that concept. And then you are actually trained. If you are training drivers any other way, when they get to the end of whatever training program you have, they're not trained. They have been exposed, some of it stuck, but if you haven't required them to master the competency, then they're not going to be what you need them to be. And too many times what I see as service providers say, well, he went to truck driving school. I'm like, well, yeah, this is the minimum required, minimum requirement to get a CDL. But is he prepared to work in your company? And what I try to help people understand is drivers are your ambassadors. And not just to your customer, in this case FedEx, but they're also representing you on the highway. Mm-hmm. And if they do something and it goes sideways, you're the one that's going to be held accountable. You own the company. And if it's a dramatic situation, then you might be dealing with that for years, and everything you own is at risk. And so you're not just training them and trying to check the box. You're trying to put an asset in your truck that's going to protect you.
Well, you're not training to cover your butt. You're training to avoid the accident.
Yes.
If you can look at any accident and go, if you really looked at it, what didn't I do? Did I select the wrong person? Did I not talk about that in the interview? Did that not come out right? Did I not train them of the expectation? There's always something when you got to look in the mirror. And you can lie to yourself and say, well, I'm covered. I had a policy. I had them watch a video. I told them what they should do. If they can't do it, it doesn't matter. So you have to make sure that they can actually, they know the expectation and they can give you the expectation. And you have the tools. You have a camera to be able to see, is that guy giving me the behaviors that I taught him for? And to your point on Smith Systems, if not, I'm going to go back and spend some time with him on that. I'm going to get in the truck and I'm going to retrain him, because you're going to have that with almost everybody you bring in.
Yeah.
If you hire 100 drivers, 2 of them you might not have to touch, right? Yeah. They'd be great. The other 98 you're going to work on.
You know what? I'm really excited about this service. We have several customers that are using it now, and the fact that we can bring to the service provider space a soup to nuts onboarding program and monthly or regular training or regular monitoring, I should say, of cameras and hours of service. But, sometimes customers still get in trouble on safety. And now at myGroundForce, we've partnered with you guys, and we have what we call the 911 service, where if you find yourself with a tier 1 safety, the best you're going to do in the metals program is bronze, and you are on the fast track to getting an opportunity to cure. I always love that word, opportunity to cure. Okay, what you really are is in the fast lane to being a former contractor.
Yep.
And so you have got to treat that as a 911. And if you do what I call essentially practicing the same thing but just doing it harder, okay, well, then you're not going to succeed. And so talk to us a little bit, because you guys just did it for one of my customers that were my myGroundForce customer. They found themselves sideways. Talk to us about this 911 service. That's what I call it, but I want you guys deliver it on our behalf, and we partner with you on that. But talk to us about how you approach that and how you help customers fix
So,
those
if you've
things.
gotten to that point, we're going to come in and do a risk audit, a full risk audit. And it's a combination of a DOT audit, OSHA audit, insurance audit. We're going to look at everything in your operation that creates risk.
So it's like a complete gap analysis.
Complete gap analysis. And when we do it, it's trust but verify, right? And when we first started, I used to laugh because my partner John would do it, and I would sit with them, and he would say, do you have DQ files? And they'd say, oh yeah, we have DQ files. Well, let me see. Right? Or they'd have a disciplinary process, and he'd say, so you write drivers up for this? Yeah. Okay. Well, this driver did this. Let me see the write-up. And if they didn't have it, he'd say, okay, so you don't have that, right? So, a lot of people will say, yeah, I think I have this in place, but they haven't done it or haven't looked for it. So we're going to come in and look at everything, find every gap. And then we're going to take the 80-20 rule. We're going to say, look, 20% of this is creating 80% of your problem, right? If you're in trouble, for example, with FedEx on your KIs, there's about 20% that you need to address right away, and that's going to fix most of your KIs. It's not going to fix everything, but it's going to get you out of being kicked out, right? So we're going to attack that right away. And I think sometimes when they get in trouble, they think, oh, I got to do all this stuff. This list is huge. It really isn't. And they don't have the capacity to do it where we do. We're going to come in, we're going to do that analysis, and we're going to say, all right, let us attack this 20%. And that might mean us coming to meet with your drivers. That might mean us training your supervisors. That, it just means us providing some hands-on. We might send 5 or 6 people in there, either remotely or hands-on, to do stuff for them, because you got to turn that ship fast. Everything else you can do slow. You can't do too much change with drivers all at once, but you got to fix it, because if you don't, you're never going to get turned around.
You're going to lose your wife's jewelry and your kids' toys. That's what's going to happen. I mean, the drivers are actually either protecting you or putting you as a human, your company, at risk. And you have to see it that way. You cannot just see safety as something you check the box. No. It is a power move to invest in safety from the jump. And if you haven't done it to this point, you need to do it. And with us at myGroundForce, through our partnership, we can give you a world-class training program for a fraction of the cost. You could never develop this program on your own. But we have expert partners who have a lifetime of experience in this space that not only understand truck driving, they not only understand logistics, they understand safety, but they understand how to teach drivers about safety and get their behaviors aligned with the expectations. And look, it's not going to get easier to be a contractor at FedEx. It's only going to continue to get harder. When I started, it was way harder to be a contractor by the time I sold my business. And it's only going to continue to be harder. FedEx is under pressure. They're going to shift those responsibilities to contractors. And they're going to require more from you. And so you need to invest in these training programs. Whether you source it from John and I, or you source it on your own, you need to take responsibility for having a soup to nuts life cycle management program for all your drivers and all your employees. And it starts with how you hire, and then it becomes how you onboard, how you train them, how you monitor their behaviors, and how you continually reinforce those behaviors throughout their time as your employee. What I saw is I would have drivers that would have a good 12 months, and then all of a sudden they're having a bad week or a couple bad weeks in a row. And I'm like, oh, something happened. And then you find out they're going through something that's stressing them personally, and they're distracted without touching their phone, without touching the radio, but their mind is somewhere else. Sometimes they'll trigger a video and you hear them yelling at their significant other, right? And you're like, okay, I would take those guys out of the truck. He needed some time. And so I really appreciate you being with us here today. We've talked about a lot of things that might not have been covered very often in how service providers ought to run their company. We've talked about a life cycle training program, and then how you actually execute that. And then we've talked about hours of service management, camera management, and what we really focused on, or what you use the word like every other sentence the right way, is behavior. Too many times as service providers, we get caught up in checking the box for FedEx without realizing that we're trying to protect our companies. The reason all these rules exist is because FedEx expects you to be a real trucking company. And so don't treat it as is, I have this requirement that FedEx is putting on me and costing me money. You chose to be in the trucking business, so get in the trucking business.
Well, we see a lot of contractors that are in the trucking business, right? They're a FedEx contractor, but they're also running some business outside of FedEx.
Yeah, and do you see a difference with those guys?
No, because you're going to, if you're getting in trouble with FedEx, you're going to get in trouble with DOT.
But do you find guys that run on the DOT side, are they just like most contractors? They're just trying to meet the FedEx requirements, or are they better at managing their FedEx business because they have a DOT business?
I would say they're better at DOT because they do FedEx. That's what I see. Because they have those KIs, and usually the ones that are successful with FedEx, and they transfer that into their
that's a great message.
DOT business. So now they're already doing the stuff they're supposed to. And like you said, FedEx isn't asking for anything that DOT is not going to ask for,
right, that
your insurance company is not going to ask for. So when you're doing those things and you go into the regular trucking industry, you're going to be okay with DOT. You're going to be okay with FedEx, or with insurance. That's why FedEx is asking for that.
And there's a ton of these things that we automate in the myGroundForce software. So when you combine the fusion service that we get with this expert, the technology adept humans that are in John's company, with what we do for you in the myGroundForce solution, well, now you have a true world-class safety program that you can be proud of, and that you should expect positive results in your company.
Well, it's a great way to, when you're a small company, you can't afford a big-time safety manager. You can't afford to pay $150,000 a year for a real high-level safety manager. They can get your system and get all those tools. You still need it,
whether it's 3 trucks or 100.
But it's all capacity, right? Yeah. You can bring in a tool that gives you all that capacity without bringing in a person, right? So that's the big thing.
That's our whole message. That's what Fusion is. We bring world-class tools to the table for FedEx contractors, service providers. Sorry, FedEx doesn't let me say contractors anymore. I'm trying, okay? So we bring world-class experts like John to you at a fractional price. You could never afford to hire these people yourself, but now you can. So, John, thanks for being with us today on the Taking Care of Business podcast. Hey, hit us on mygroundforce.com, and where you can learn more about what we bring to the table for safety and our many other Fusion services. We look forward to seeing you on our next podcast, Taking Care of Business. See you later.